Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Mr. Foot, the one and only. It's about the invisible wall, and this is kind of a reintroduction one. If you haven't been following this series, this is a good one to start with. Mr. Foot begins, "Welcome back to whatever this series has become. We will continue our discussion on the invisible wall." A quick refresher for anyone who's new here. This series is based on an idea that was originally formulated by the eccentric game dev Yoko Taro. Let's assume that there are artistic expressions that can't or shouldn't be created because of physical limitations or maybe due to ethical concerns. In that case, there's a difference between the art that could be created and the art that is actually created, and we call the line separating these the invisible wall. In this series, we look at how art is created and how or why one might want to go beyond the wall. Another useful way to think of it might be what we saw as a diagram in an earlier parlay, which is a sort of inner circle, which is the games that we all accept can be created or we've seen created. Maybe the games that you expect to be created. We'll get back to that. Then there's the invisible wall, which is kind of the barrier of your expectations. Games that could be created but have not, or you haven't been exposed to them. And then games perhaps beyond that that literally can't be created. And so there are kind of three zones potentially, if that's a more useful way to think of it. But it's basically that the invisible wall is like the border of what we expect from media. The cracks in our walls. There is a big thing that has been missing from our discussions so far, Mr. Foot says. We've been acting as if the invisible wall is this objective concept that's out there, a concept we can all agree on, when in reality it's more like each and every one of us has our own walls, walls that have been shaped by our environment and the art we experience. We all think we know what kinds of art can be created when the experience we have exceeds what we think is possible. When we see something beyond our personal invisible wall, that's when the wall breaks and what we thought was possible has changed forever. Invisible wall break would be a mouthful, which is why I prefer to call it a reset of expectations or just a reset for short. A few things. Okay, so that'll be useful. Basically, a topic in this parlay is going to be when your invisible wall moves, you could say, and we'll call that a reset. It's resetting your expectations, right? Some of you, me included, may be pushing back a little bit against the wording that we all think we know what kinds of art can be created. Like how ridiculous to assume that you actually know like what kinds of things are possible. But I mean, as somebody who tries very hard to not assume that they know everything that's coming, because I don't, that's ridiculous, no one does. And just take what comes. I obviously still have expectations for what if I had to guess, would expect is coming. So even if am I less surprised than other people? Not necessarily, but even if I don't think that I knew how things were before, and then when something new comes, I go, whoa, I had never even imagined that was possible. I did imagine it was possible. I just didn't suspect I would encounter it. I don't think it matters too much. I think a lot of you, open-minded and curious people who want to hear people waffle about these subjects during Parlay, probably you don't think you know what's coming, but the point still stands. I think Mr. Foot's being totally reasonable, and I got kind of defensive when I read that wording, so I'm trying to accept my apology. I'm trying to disarm that defensiveness. Additionally, acting as if the invisible wall is this objective concept that's out there, a concept we can all agree on, I haven't been meaning to act that way, but so far we haven't focused as much on the individual differences between our invisible walls or expectation thresholds. So certainly I would agree with that. I don't think of it as an objective concept that's out there, but lots of people think of anything that's named like this, the invisible wall, as like a single invisible wall, like an objective concept. If you think this way, I think it is often useful to bash it down. There generally isn't like a single objective form of the idea that we can all agree on. And we know that because there you go, we can't all agree on it. Anyway, moving on. So far, we've talked about pretty extreme examples of resets in this series. Stuff like making bad art on purpose and screwing with the relationship between the author and the audience. Most resets, for most people, are a lot simpler. It can be something like a game's world exceeding the scale we thought possible, or the spectacle of a boss fight exceeding our expectations by an order of magnitude. But of course, not all resets are built equal. Exceeding expectations is not quite the same as redefining them. A true reset has to either 1. create and deliver on the promise of an experience that is so unique compared to what we've seen, so far beyond our personal invisible wall, that it has no choice but to reset our expectations. Basically just surpasses where our wall is by a lot. Or 2, break the promise of the game, if it's in a video game, to do something the players didn't explicitly agree to, and reset their expectations that way. This is simpler to achieve than 1, and could, for example, be done by combining elements that we didn't expect to be combined. Explicit examples for both are on their way. Mr. Fu concludes this segment saying, I firmly believe that most people's favorite art is art that is either connected to their social life, not in the scope of this parlay, or art that is expectation resetting for them at the time they experienced it. Yeah, I think this is a great way to think about it. So there's kind of 2 bits in here. Finding a way to conceptualize what things are expectation resets for a lot of people, and also 2 different kinds of them that Mr. Food is laying out. So the idea that for a lot of people, you'll find maybe something that's their favorite. If it seems inexplicable, it might be easier to understand, and you'll notice this if you go looking, if you think of that thing as maybe that pushed the boundaries of what they expected from media forward. You know, sometimes I see people that enjoyed something I thought was pretty run-of-the-mill or a little messy or just kind of weird. And I often imagine that it must be because they found that at a time in their life when it adjusted their expectations in a pleasant way. They were maybe bored and it was just so weird, and that was kind of satisfying or helpful at that point in time, where it might have been just like what's going on for other people. And I think that's a common theme, that things that will reset people's expectations, depending on the kind of reset, I think it may or may not be very noticeable in the work, unless you really go digging or do some detective work. I think that has to do with the type of reset it is. So let's break them down, and I'll show you what I mean. So reset number 1, basically you just push the ceiling of what is possible by a lot. I think that this first way of resetting expectations is often just like technology. It becomes possible to do things this way, or much easier logistically, probable that you'd be able to do things this way. And the reset is basically happening because not all of the audience knows that it became quite probable to be able to make something with this technology. And so they're surprised when they see it exist. If you told me right now that we can make virtual reality games where you put a helmet on and it just uses your thoughts to control it, and I accepted that, then if you then gave me one of those games, it wouldn't move my expectations forward as much as if I just stumbled across a helmet and put it on and went, whoa, a virtual reality game that just works and I'm not moving my physical body, but it feels like I am. I didn't know that was possible. You see what I mean? Most of the reason that would be moving my expectations forward would be because I didn't previously know that existed. Now, depending on your level of arrogance, I don't assume that for sure doesn't exist, because I just think it's foolish to do that. But I mean, I don't think that is a thing that I will encounter in the next, few years. So sure, if I were to experience that, it would reset my expectations simply by brute force, you could think of it as. I think it will be useful to give names to these 2 types of resetting. So I'm going to name them. I'm going to name number 1, brute forcing it. And this is basically just making something that's much more than what your expectations were. Number 2 is a trickier one. I'll read what it said it was again. Break the promise of the game, or piece of media generally, to do something the players didn't explicitly agree to, and reset their expectations that way. This is simpler to achieve than 1, and could, for example, be done by combining elements that we didn't expect to be combined. Just making something very weird could change your expectations. You might just think it's really weird, and that distinction might matter. But this one, I would say, is more... I'm going to call it a mix-up or a change-up, something like that. It's not really about more, it's about combining things that you didn't expect to have combined, or changing the rhythm or type of experience that the player or the audience member is having. It's going to be mostly game examples in this parlay because I think that does make it much easier. The player has to actually play the game, so if the example is a video game, you can physically make them do something different. That makes it a bit easier to see that it's kind of a mix-up. and would reset their expectations for what they need to learn, in a very simple way, rather than just, oh, I thought this would be an action movie, but this part doesn't have as much action as I expected from an action movie. That might not change your expectations very much. You might just say, well, it's just a not very action movie. And again, we may come back to that point. Let's do a few examples because Mr. Fruit, you included a few, and I thought they were really good. So an example of the brute force type of reset. I gave a kind of virtual reality example, something similar, Mr. Fruit says. An example of a type 1 reset, a brute force expectation reset, for Mr. Food anyway, can be found in Before Your Eyes, a game that is controlled with your physical eyes, where you blinking is an essential game mechanic. This is so far away from any game most people have seen that a reset becomes unavoidable. For now, which I think is a key aspect of these types of resets. In the future, it may become commonplace to have such things, and it would be weird to have a game that showcased such a commonplace technology as like a core game mechanic. But at the moment, that technology is, I think it's fair to say, not widespread. And so, it will reset most people's expectations. A couple more complicated examples of type 2 resets, so the mix-ups or change-ups. Mr. Food has a narrative type 2 reset in The Beginner's Guide. That game promises to be an exploration of an artist's psyche through their art, only to become a whole bunch of other things. A lesson in the dangers of unreliable narration, a look into the complexities and traps of the author-audience relationship, etc. Whatever your interpretation is, it probably has little to do with what was promised, based on the promotional material. And the change here also goes beyond what we would have expected from a plot twist. Yeah, I would agree. I think that this is a great example. When we say the game promises to be an exploration of an artist's psyche through their art, only to become blah, 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 blah. I believe I understand Mr. Fu when I say we mean the game establishes that, can suggest that that's what it'll be about. Our narrator essentially says that that's what it's going to be about. He almost directly, literally says, this is going to be an exploration of Coda's games. And then Davey, over the course of the narrative, begins inadvertently demonstrating his, the true shtick of the story, that in fact the story is arguably more about Davey than about Coda. And the narrative does this a couple of ways that we could break down in great detail, but we've got a lot of Parley left. But basically, simply by very, very slowly changing the amount of the text that is about the artist's psyche to be overtaken by text that is about unreliable narration. Gradually. And so the narrative has time to establish that your expectations are that this is a story about someone's art. The narrator literally tells you that's what it's about, and then it transitions to being something you probably didn't expect, since those expectations were thoroughly established and delivered on, but then subtly changed over time. Another example, an example of a structural type 2 kind of mix-up, change-up, reset can be found in Warframe. The game was a corridor-based looter-shooter. Nobody expected or asked for cinematic quests, but I'd argue that going beyond the original premise of the game is the basis of the game's long-term success 7+ years later. Well, it certainly is a thing Warframe does a lot of times. I mean, Warframe also has open worlds and fishing and animal conservation, and you mimic an animal's cry with a whistle, and mining, and a roguelike game mode, and a lot of things that you wouldn't have expected from a corridor-based looter shooter. Now, I'm not sure I want to get too much into the argument that going beyond the original premise of the game is like why Warframe is successful. I think that it has to do with including those things, but not because they go beyond the original premise, but because they have some surprising synergy. They're actually rather close to the original premise. And I'm going to make that point at greater length in the second half of the Parley, but I'll gently make it now. I think that when you look at all these weird things Warframe's doing, you can see that they have circumstantial synergy with Warframe. For example, the cinematic quests provide these very specific moments that you can rally around in a game that is a lot of potentially monotonous grinding. And so that really breaks it up in a nice way. It brings people back for a set reason, even though they might have all these long-term goals. It gives them more of a short-term goal, too. It's a nice complement to the way that the game is when you're just grinding for some item you want. And Having an open world sounds really different than a corridor-based looter shooter, but the open world environments are designed kind of like the bigger rooms in the corridor looter shooter missions, and you can usually get most of the rewards, like the new weapons or whatever, without doing the mining or the conservation or whatever, or at least without doing it very much. Generally, there's something like in Heart of Deimos, you can do ISO vaults, which give you a ton of resources from the planet, or you can gain experience with the Syndicate on the planet other ways, so you can get the rewards mostly without doing those new mechanics. While a good amount of the game, in terms of raw content, yes, is something that you wouldn't expect from a corridor-based looter shooter, when you look at how they're honoring the promise of the game, you can get the rewards from that are offered in the game by playing a corridor-based looter shooter. When you look at the open world, they are surprisingly close to honoring that promise. You don't have to do things. You're encouraged to, but you don't have to do things that are very different from playing a corridor-based looter shooter if you don't want to, if you really don't want to. So while it is a mix-up, it definitely is something fresh and different, and I would agree that that has to do with why Warframe has been successful over the years. I would argue this is a place where we can see that perhaps the mix-up or change-up type of reset is defined by how it isn't very much of a mix-up or change-up when it's good. That is very subjective. I am going to argue in the second half of the parlay that when these resets are good as a type 2 mix-up or change-up, they do involve upchucking the kind of promise of the piece of media. It promises to be, an exploration of an artist's psyche through their art, only to become something else. It promises to be a corridor looter shooter, only to become something else. I think what you can see in many of them is that they do a good job, like people like them, is basically what I'm getting at, to the extent that they aren't much of a mix-up, while just barely remaining the minimum amount of a mix-up. We'll see if we can flesh that out in the second half, but I thought these were very good examples, and you actually have one more that I really liked too. An example of a deeply personal reset, I want to get into that topic a little, would be someone playing a long RPG for the first time in their life. Having played the RPG, what they thought was possible has changed. Their personal wall has expanded. You can see this in effect when you ask people, for example, what their favorite Final Fantasy game is. They will usually respond with whatever they played first. I believe that's because the first one they played was the one to reset their expectations. Right, so this is a good callback to that phenomenon from before, how the kind of change-up thing also is going to be somewhat subjective. You can see echoes of it in the piece of work, even if it doesn't cause a change for you, but it may be difficult to detect that it would be like a big perspective change for someone else unless you are in that position. So for type 1 resets, the overwhelming or kind of brute force ones, yeah, I mean, if your technology that detects your eye movements to control a game has become commonplace, it may be unremarkable to see a game like Before Your Eyes that is like nominally controlled with your physical eyes. But I think you can still detect that it would have been a bit of a paradigm shift for some people, that it would be a reset for some people, in that it like is very focused on that seemingly mundane to you thing. What is the weird amount of focus on that seemingly simple thing? Maybe you would smell that it would have been a sort of shift for people at the time. And with the type 2 ones, the mix-ups or change-ups, you could maybe detect it in that the work is just doing an odd mix of things. It might not seem weird to you, but when you look at it, it will feel like, well, you can't describe what this is doing as easily, I guess. It's, I don't want to say contrived, but it's just, it evades description a little more than typical media. I, for example, did not experience Evangelion, Neon Genesis Evangelion, as a particularly noteworthy work. Like, to me, it didn't have much impact. I watched it primarily because I was curious why other people thought it did have that. And while it didn't have much of an impact on me, I feel like I can, again, kind of like smell that it would have had an impact on other people because it's weird. And it's a bit of the beginner's guide pattern where it seems like it's not gonna be that weird. And there are some parts that are not that weird, but then things get really weird. And I think that that type of change up, again, I'm going to argue is common in works like this that are successful. Because it did that, I found myself thinking, wow, yeah, like maybe people found this in a transformative time in their life, and it seemed normal enough that it was comforting in that moment, but then was weird enough that it provided progress or like an opportunity for growth. I kind of get that, even though it didn't do that at all for me, and I just thought it was weird. It was interesting, but it's not like I didn't really like it or enjoy it, but it didn't mean much to me, is I guess the difference. So I do still think that there is something about the work intrinsically, if it is innovative for a brute force type of reset, or if it is I'm gonna use the term convoluted, but I don't mean it in a negative way. If it's convoluted, it's a very unusual combination of elements for a type 2 or mix up or change up type of reset. You can detect that those qualities will correlate with it being a reset for more people, even though they are not on their own enough. Really, ever, nothing is ever enough for it to be a reset sort of objectively. There is no objective to the invisible wall or things that will reset it. I thought these were really good examples, Mr. Food, by the way. We struggled for most of this series so far to have good examples, and you really nailed it. Like that was great. I actually wrote a few examples in my notes that I'm just not going to use because they're not as good as those. Right on. They were really good. And of course, they were ones I was kind of familiar with mostly, so that helps. Okay, we move on to part 2. That was a fun little observation so far. Let's get controversial. I take issue with something you've said both on stream and in part 4 of this series. I'll quote the latter. This is me quoting you, quoting me. Okay, I guess I'll leave this up. Games telling you what they're about, what the experience is, and then you having that experience is one of the most important things you want to do if you want your game to be good. That is because when the game throws something new at you, it promises that even though this is uncomfortable and different, this will ultimately be about the thing you have so far liked. That's the end of my quote from you, from me. Look, I get it, Mr. Food continues. I even agree. It is bad game design if you break the promise you made to the players. I've criticized many games, from Elden Ring to Starfield, for setting up promises that they then proceed to break, and this is a great explanation of what I meant if you don't get it so far. Mr. Food continues, Elden Ring has combat challenges, where the fundamental promise is that you can beat everything by dodging at the right time and hitting enemies, that cannot be reasonably engaged with without breaking or effectively disabling the enemy AI. Starfield has no meaningful exploration, which is the foundation of every other game system, destroying the entire experience. It sucks. There is nothing I hate more than an unfulfilled promise. And what comes next might at first seem like an argument I made in the past, but it isn't. Games should break their promises, create new ones, and introduce things that are uncomfortable beyond their novelty. Otherwise, we're limited to the type 1 kind of resets, the brute force ones. And even in our modern landscape of video games, that is sadly a very limited amount of experiences. Okay, we have the core conceit of part 2. Mr. Food is saying that while, of course, it's a problem if games don't even acknowledge the practice of making a promise with the player, that is, the game purports to be about something, but then just like completely fails to follow up on that promise, that is undeniably bad game design. It arguably makes the game incoherent. Like, it almost isn't even a complete game without something like this. If the game is going to be about exploration, and then the rest of the game systems build around exploration, there has to be meaningful exploration. You can't just make that not be a mechanic. And in games like Elden Ring, if the difficulty is going to be based on you dodging or evading enemies and then sneaking in attacks in a certain way, you can't just suddenly not do that and have the player easily come out unscathed. I mean, they decided they liked the game up until this point because they felt like the difficulty was a certain way that they agree they enjoy. Maybe the game makes it very clear when attacks are coming. It's just hard to time the dodge correctly. You can basically just keep your wits about you, perhaps try again a few times, and you'll get it, the game says. Or maybe the game has very difficult to time inputs, so you learn that you basically need to memorize the enemy's attack patterns, but oh, is it rewarding when you get it right. The game would want to keep following up on that. If, for example, the second game were to then make enemies where you really didn't need to memorize their attack pattern, I presume for somebody who was able to memorize the convoluted attack patterns from earlier in the game, it would be somewhat easy, to say the least, to deal with enemies that are, you can see the telegraph coming. Or it would feel like, well, what's the point? The whole trick was that things were unexpected. It's not exciting in the same way now. On the other hand, the game where telegraphs were quite clear would feel cheap if they suddenly weren't. I mean, in a simple way, this just isn't going to reliably attract players that will enjoy the whole game. If you tell the player it's going to be about this, and they agree that they like that, but then you make it about that, it just seems like kind of a waste of time on the surface. Like, why did you lie to me? I would have told you whether I liked that thing, if that's what you wanted to make, but you told me it wasn't going to be that, and then you did this. I think I confused. You get it. So indeed, that while that can be a problem, Mr. Food goes on to argue that you said should, and it's not just because I'm trying to get myself to stop saying should so much. You can say should, but I think a useful way to think of what Mr. Food's claiming here is you're saying that games must try to break their promises, even though it's a huge problem if you don't establish a promise. Because if you don't have games that try to break promises and do something different, do a mix-up or a change-up, we're limited in gaming to only ever be surprised by the first type of mental reset, by brute force resets. And those are very limited. They basically require pushing the boundary of what is physically possible, rather than just ideas people have had. And you're only going to get so much pushing the boundary of what is physically possible. This is kind of outside the scope of this parlay, but in particular, it occurs to me that why don't you think for a second about what kind of people have access to the money that means they can push the boundary of technology in games. And then I want you to think about what kinds of games are usually made with specifically a ton of money and therefore access to those technologies. I think that makes the point well enough. There, not a whole lot, not hugely innovative, not always our greatest game design in gaming. It will reset your expectations, but you may not have much fun actually playing the games if they're basically just technology showcases. That was some big shade to a few games that I'm not naming specifically. Anywho, yes, okay, so we would have a very limited scope of possible surprises or updates to our perspective, broadening of our horizons, maybe, if we didn't have games that kind of mixed up on their promise. At the same time, I would argue, Mr. Food, that you are basically arguing here that what I said is absolutely true. We do need to establish these promises. And your problem seems to be that it almost sounds like I'm overemphasizing the maintaining the promise. Don't ever let your game violate those promises once you've established them. And you're saying, well, no, you have to sometimes, otherwise nothing could be surprising or novel. Yeah, I agree. This isn't controversial. I have no disagreement. Yep, no notes. Good. Sure. What we have is a model where, yeah, it seems like the easiest way to effectively create a type 2 reset, these sort of mental change-ups or mix-ups, is to effectively establish promises from your piece of media, tell the audience what it's about, but then find a way to shift them in a way that is unexpected, yet feels like a natural extension of those promises. I am going to go on to argue for the rest of the parlay that that is what defines when this is done well. It's usually not much of a promise break, basically. I mostly agree with you, but I don't think it usually goes well unless it's rather subtle, basically. Let's continue. As for the type 2 resetting our expectations, it's difficult if we know how the game is going to do it. Introducing elements that fit your promise only prevents you from ever resetting the audience's expectations. Yep, what we were talking about before. It's one thing to fulfill the promise of the game, but in my mind, that's not the end goal. It's the first step. The second step would be surpassing the expectations created by the promise, and the third step is to deliver on something that the player didn't consider promisable. I think that this is a great model to think about it with. So let's look at something like the beginner's guide. The first step, getting the basics right, if the game is going to do anything, be a good game, create a type 2 expectation reset for us, whatever the game is going to do, we're oversimplifying a little bit, but it seems in this model like it's got to establish promises. What is the game about? It does that thing consistently. Then it surpasses that thing. I would argue this is like the scope is beyond what you expected, and then it delivers on something the player didn't think was even on offer or promisable. The game succeeds at something before promising it to the player, or the promise is a bit hidden. In other words, the beginner's guide shows you a look at the artist's psyche, but also subtly, while you aren't looking at first, achieves a look at unreliable narration as well, which you didn't know was being promised, but then you get it. The promise is fulfilled. Interesting. It's that's not a way I've thought about it before. Mr. Boot finishes with a bit of a call out to games that are merely good, which I think clears up a not disconnect, but a slight misunderstanding between this quote that I made. Mr. Fruit says the first step, establishing that promise, only matters if you want a good game. I don't care about good games. What I'm looking for are extraordinary games, extraordinary art. I fear that by focusing on the premise instead of what lies beyond, we lose sight of all those beautiful resets we might have created or experienced otherwise. This is best exemplified by a saying that goes something like, monkeys can ascend to great heights by climbing trees, but they will never reach the moon. The metaphor is left as homework to the viewer. Monkeys can ascend to great heights by climbing trees, but they will never reach the moon. What are your thoughts? Do I have a point here? And again, I think you do. I think it's good you said that, because one of the reasons I provided this idea that focusing on the game's promises is good advice is because I think it's just that, good advice, not a maxim, not something that's universally always the most important thing. It's just that I believe, as you point out with games like Starfield, for example, most modern gaming doesn't even get the basic thing right. It wouldn't do to try to go further than that without establishing like basic game coherence. I think a lot of games don't properly have a statement of a promise the game is going to fulfill, and then they also don't fulfill it, partly because it's not fully formed. You're writing a video, and the goal of the video is not firmly established before you write it. The video comes out only okay, and the reason is that it's kind of unfocused, not because you were unfocused as much as there wasn't an established focus, always. There are games where this isn't the problem. Again, Elden Ring has very clearly established focuses. It just doesn't necessarily consistently deliver on its promise to uphold them, and it doesn't seem like the fails to uphold the promise are intentional. They don't do something else good instead. You can absolutely break the rules. I'm not, stick to the code or whatever. I'm just saying that for a lot of games, I don't think we're really there yet. I think that the game is not getting the basic mechanism of having an enjoyable experience right. I think a lot of developers must undervalue how important it can be to players that a game consistently fulfills the thing they signed up for, before doing something else too, if it wants to, sure. For all its problems, I think Warframe is pretty good at consistently fulfilling like the way that you get things in the game, like grinding. It's not very complicated, but it is pretty consistent in that. And so you feel like you get the idea that when new content comes out, there are going to be new weapons that you can farm for. They're going to be apples to oranges. You can use whatever you want with the weapons you already have that are powerful. They're not necessarily going to make you way more powerful, and you're going to get them by grinding the new piece of content. And even though there's all this crazy shit going on, Warframe does consistently fulfill that precept at the very least. That's not a very ambitious promise, but that's fine. It still does the thing. So I don't disagree with you that it is more valuable to make a game that is extraordinary. It seems pedestrian to suggest that the most important thing is to just make a game that's basically good. But one reason that I emphasize this point so much, though I was never trying to say that it's like the most important thing and you should focus on it to the expense of what lies beyond, but the reason I focused on it so much was coming from a place where, like in build systems, in my topic of discussion of choice on most of my videos, I believe this is really the place where it's more of an issue. There are almost no examples of games just like getting the basics right. It's like trying to learn a martial art and there's no one who has mastered the basics and you're just doing mix-ups all the time. It basically isn't even a coherent martial art yet. There is no one who is doing a sort of consistent technique. Any consistent technique that you could then, rip on or replicate. That's okay, that kind of primordial soup, but imagine how good it could be if we had some consistent techniques to branch off of and make crazy stuff based on. Uh, that would be cool. The counterplay, the mix ups we could have, it would be really good. And so I would say that my focus on this design precept is mostly coming from my identification of the what ails build systems in gaming. Many of them just don't seem to get close to embracing a promise in the first place, let alone kind of mix up on it. But across media generally, I mostly agree. I mean, you don't need to tell the same story over and over again. Think how many more combinations we have if you combine two or whatever. And there are good amounts of narratives like that. I really recently, for example, enjoyed Lae'zel in Baldur's Gate 3, who is a story I have heard before, but there are other flavors mixed in that I didn't know I wanted that combination. I thought I knew who this character was, and the way that we get a kind of a fair shake of what happens to her, I'm trying very hard to avoid spoilers, really made it enjoyable to me in a way that I would have thought I don't want that character. You know what I mean? But I ended up having a lot of fun with her part of the story. A lot of fun when I had expected to dread that character. And that was because they did exactly what you're saying. They established a promise, but that was only the baseline thing. And they were primarily focused on creating some change-ups and shifting our perspective. Well, not all of ours, but I think a lot of people were pleasantly surprised by Lae'zel. She's an asshole to you, and yet tons of people like her. I don't think that many people have that fetish. It's partially because it's a mix-up for a lot of people. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's fine. I'm not really saying that I don't. It's not just being cussed out that I want. My point is, I agree. It's really not controversial at all, as far as if I'm understanding you correctly. Now, I do have kind of a closing note, though, which is about the kind of anatomy of achieving one of these type 2 kind of expectation change-ups. I want to talk a little bit about kind of conflict that I have when thinking about sort of questioning the value of doing these mix-ups entirely, I guess. Not that I don't think it's useful to reset your expectations. Broadening your horizons is almost intrinsically valuable to me, although that's probably a whole parlay to do in and of itself. Like, why is it, what do you even accomplish by broadening your horizons? Sure, but I'm not saying that I don't think that's valuable, though I think that does bear explanation we don't have time for. I do accept that as being inherently valuable. No, it's more that I'm thinking that in some cases, I don't believe that mixing up the expectations is useful, or like there's just kind of no point. Like I don't fully see the point in doing that. Let me break down what I mean. So I liked the Final Fantasy example, where you can see this is an example of a type of expectation change. Type 1 or type 2, you could disagree. I think often a type 1 one, it's a brute force expectation change, where you kind of need it to be that the player goes in with certain expectations and then they're kind of bucked during the time playing, because the expectation being bucked is that the game will be this fast. You know what I mean? Same thing with Baldur's Gate 3. The main expectation that was changed when I played Baldur's Gate 3 was the scope of the game. You couldn't have it be that the scope of the game was beyond your expectations at the beginning of the game. That's not what that means, that it's at the end, the later part of the game, right? So there are some expectations where you cannot start the game with that expectation being bucked. The goal of the game can't be from the very start the player is in awe of how this game is longer than they expected, it can't be because they are in hour one of the game. The game cannot be longer than they expected yet. They have not played any of the game. But there are expectations that you could set out to overcome. You could make a game designed to flip people's expectations where I don't accept that it's productive to not just do it from the start. That's what I'm getting at. So let me make another example. Let's look at a game like if we look at Warframe, for example. I think that the blend of things available in Warframe isn't worse if it was just from the beginning. A lot of stuff in Warframe doesn't really get online as a meaningful part of the game until a little bit of time on, depending on how you play. You might just not encounter it that soon, but I don't think it would be a worse game if it did happen at the beginning. It's not like Warframe lulls you into a sense of corridor-based looter-shooterism or something, and then it's because you had that expectation that the cinematic quests are good. I don't really accept that. I wouldn't agree with that. I think that if they were more consistently paced and good, frankly, from the beginning of the story, that would be better, or at least it would lose very little from its current state. You do get an initial little shock value from the fact that the game kind of isn't like that too much, and then it kind of comes out of the woodwork, but you also miss a lot of people, and I think that the little shock value is not that important. To me, anyway, I'm questioning the value of that. Does that make sense as a premise? Let's look at the beginner's guide example as well to break this down again. So is this one where, the change up to your expectations does come a lot of the way through the game? The game sets expectations and then flips them. Would it defeat the point if that happened at the beginning? Yes, I would argue. The gimmick of the beginner's guide, and that's not meant to be said in a negative way, is that you expect it to be about the artist you're being shown, but it is actually the person showing the artist that you end up focusing on. You sort of look at the art exhibit, but then slowly turn to the narrator that's showing you it. And I think it's that turning that is the sort of the special thing about the game, I guess, the story. You could make a story that was just about unreliable narrators from the very beginning. And there are games and stories like that. But it doesn't accomplish the same thing if you do it right from the start. My main point is that in gameplay, I think primarily in gameplay, for mechanical gameplay things in video games, I think you usually lose very little or nothing, and you gain quite a lot. People will know that the thing is different if you just do it the way you're going to do it from the beginning. So for another example, let's say you have a game that has it's build systems. I mean, that's what's on my mind, of course. And this new build system works like this. The gimmick is that it's a roguelike. So you're going to go in, get upgrades as you go. They'll reset when you die. But how it works is whenever you don't pick an upgrade, it gets buffed, up to a certain cap. And those buffs persist between runs. You can have this provide variety. You can play through the game, and different runs, different things will be stronger. Something didn't look appealing enough to you the first time. Next time, it will be more powerful, and more powerful, hopefully until it hits a threshold where you're excited to give it a try, making the player feel great about a variety of stuff, like they don't have to use something they think is weaker, or that feels weaker, until it feels awesome to choose. In theory, anyway. I'm just making this up. Eventually, the game could feel like it became about something a little different, purposefully avoiding upgrades that you wish were stronger to overcome late game challenges. Sure, it might evolve over the course of the playthrough, but basically all that's happening there is that now that your expectations have been recalibrated to like, oh, this is a game mechanic we're doing? Cool. That a game might have already done that, but whatever. Now, sure, like there's a bunch of new interesting design stuff you can do with that. But I hope you can see my point. I don't think that a game would be better if it was a normal roguelike where this didn't happen, but then halfway through the game you like unlocked the ability for upgrades to get stronger if you don't pick them over time. You know what I mean? That's fine, but I don't really see why that's better than if you just did it at the beginning of the game. It's pretty cool and kind of weird and might make you think about the game differently. It seems good to give the player more time to kind of adjust to that and to show it off. Like people can find this new thing better. If the point of the mix-ups, the point of the resets, is to broaden your horizons, people knowing that something would broaden their horizons, like on the tin, on the cover of the product, is definitely a plus, in my opinion. Now, there is one obvious trade-off, which is that it's not a surprise. The player will know that's going to happen in the game. They're not going to be surprised to find that things are growing in power over time. You could make it happen from the start of the game, but just not advertise it or like try to hide it somehow, basically. You could do that. That's a topic for another time. Some games do this. They'll adjust the player's power without telling them, though it's almost impossible they won't find out nowadays. Anyway, but again, my question stands. I think that for a lot of, it seems to me mostly mechanical or like gameplay type mix-ups, there isn't much of a clear benefit to not just doing them from the start. Like they're briefly surprising, I guess. It would only be, I guess the main thing that comes to mind would be, what if it was a gameplay mix-up that sounds bad to most people? Like that you think most people won't agree that that sounds cool, but you play tested it or whatever and everybody loved it. People are going to like it, but you have to kind of trick people into enjoying it. You know what I mean? I guess. And then again, like another thing that I think is a problem about it, you kind of like waiting for a mix up, is that it does mean that players that are looking for something they would have found relaxing may be rudely awakened from that relaxation by something bucking their expectations. Whereas I think it's great for people to say when they are ready to have their horizons broadened or to buck their expectations. You often find that people experiencing something arguably very interesting, but just at the wrong time, will just disconnect. They'll see it as an annoyance at the time, and it was basically wasted. There was really no point in showing them that right now. You have to wait until they are ready to see something like that, and then they could maybe appreciate it, even though it's like not strictly good. They don't strictly like it, but it is interesting given the right moment. I think that this phenomenon favors making it clear what the mix-up will be, rather than hiding it. Because if you hide it, you're basically just rolling the dice. It's worse than that, actually. You're selecting for people who want to relax and do the thing they think they see, but then you trick them with something that they didn't see coming, but you're actually selecting for people who just said they don't want that, because that's why they picked this thing they thought they knew. I feel like it's mostly negative for it to be a surprise in the middle for gameplay mix-ups. Again, it's maybe a different story for, we gave a few examples of where you kind of can't have it be from the beginning. So that's my main wrinkle in this discussion. Overall, yeah, I agree. I really never intended to imply otherwise. And I thought this was a great parlay to kind of reestablish, where are these mix-ups coming from for people? How do they work? Like, what are the mechanics of this? I think that you also may have been interested in brushing a topic about, what type of game would you focus on making if your goal was to make extraordinary games and not just good games? What is a recipe for the extraordinary games only? We did talk about that a little bit. I said that I think the type 1 expectations are marked by innovation, or like just a lot, like scale. And the type 2 innovations type 2 resets are usually marked by a combination of elements, like more elements put together. They're harder to describe. They seem a little contrived or convoluted, but it seems to work. Those will tend to be those things. If you wanted to make such a game, you could use new, unfamiliar technology and mash up as many games as possible that you can get to work well together. And you would probably make a game that would change people's perspective on things. Then the matter would be to adjust to make that game actually good any reliable amount of the time, probably by reducing the amount of games that you're mashing together, I would imagine. Reliably fun, or whatever it is you want to achieve. So while we didn't get into that too much directly, I do think this parlay was mostly about that. I hope that you felt like I covered this in an effective way. I kind of like that we're getting a sort of part 2, or looking at the total length of this series so far, this is kind of like a prelude to the climax of the series, which I think is cool. So I thought it was a nice idea that you had for this one. Thanks very much for asking. Thanks for your support. There's been a lot of these, and it means a lot. They're fun to do, and it's also a lot of support for my other work, which I'll tell you, it's sometimes refreshing to do these because this is a lot of work. It's like, wow, someone made a whole video, and I'm here to deliver it. So again, I hope you feel like I did okay. Talk to you soon. Looking forward to the next one.